Good evening, everybody. We continue today in chapter 43, which we began last week. I will note that we didn't have the ability, time was out basically, last week. Those of you who participated and followed the last week's class, you'll notice that we didn't have the ability again because of the time constraint to learn this very message within the text. So we're going to pick up by reading the text today, which that says that you really want to understand or better understand this chapter. Suggest you go back and last week's class and try to make the best out of it via last week's class, and it's the same Tanya Online website, tanyaonline.com website, which you could see this past class and all the previous classes practically from the very beginning of Tanya. And so needless to mention, we have to go straight into it. Over here, I just mentioned, as always, it's a website that you could it's easy to follow because the text is on a separate scroll bar accordingly. So, like I mentioned, it's we'll have to go straight into the word, get straight into the class, which will be definitely the first part, certainly textual, as we went through the entire subject in last week's class, which is again posted as well on the website. So we're holding the Ubchinas Gadlos, which is the third line or the fourth line of the very beginning of chapter Mem Gimel, which is at the 43rd chapter on page 122 in the original text. You can see it in the corresponding English text as well. So, Ubchinas Gadlos, what is the yira associated with Gadlos? Fear associated with Gadlos. Remember, these are terms which, just to go back, just a click, you'll get the whole understanding, the katnas, the Gadlos, and so on. So with a click away, you could appreciate all these terms, but we have to cover the text today, and there's no point of repeating it, even though, it's something fresh. We'd like to start, especially newcomers, like to start with a profound appreciation of what we are learning. But again, with today's technology, I welcome all of you to go back to just a click away last week's class and try to get the flow of the message of this very chapter. So what is Gadlos in Yiras Hashem? Gadlos, which means grandness in fearing God. When this yira, with this fear, is drawn from meditating the greatness of Hashem. So remember, this is still the Yira Tata, especially those of you who joined us last week. This is still the Yira Tata, the inferior Yira, but within the inferior Yira, there's Katnos and Gadlos, which is smallness and grandness. So the smallness we mentioned, again, that's the simple Yira Shamayim every Yid had, as we again mentioned last week. Gadlos is thinking about the Gdulas Hashem, the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is a fear which comes as a result of a structured meditation, pondering in the greatness of Hashem. In other words, it's thinking about Hashem, which ignites this sensation, in this case Yira, there's certain Hidbanuniyot, meditations which arouse Avas Hashem, love of Hashem, and there's the Hidbanuniyot which arouse, in other words, meditations which arouse the Yiras Hashem. Again, the sensation of awe, the sensation of fear. And in this case, the Gadlos, within Yira Tata, the inferior Yira, he says there's Gadlos as well. What is the Gadlos? The Gadlos is the pondering in the Gadlut Gdulas Hashem, the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, as opposed to the Katnos, again, it's all within Yira Tata. We're going to get to the Yira Ilah, the supreme Yira, soon. But within the Yira Tata, the inferior Yira, there is the small Katnos, and then again, translated, small, Katnos is small, and then Gadlos is great. And remember last week we mentioned Katnos is that innate Yira Shamayim, which is embedded in every single Yid. As a Yid, he fears the Almighty He fears the Almighty, but then there's a arousal which is aroused by the Yid as per his pondering in the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, that's why it's called Gadlus. It's something which is, it's worked on. In other words, remember we learned in the 3rd chapter that the structure of the nefesh, of the neshama of the Yid, it's not only one powerful energy, because it's a chelik l'kamimal, it's part of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, but no, it's comprised of 10 faculties. There's the imais and the tuldes, the intellectual faculties and the emotional faculties, as the Alter Rebbe. So the emotional faculties are offsprings. They're offsprings of the intellectual faculties, which means when you thoroughly, they're born. So the offspring, they're born as a result of the investment, the intellectual investment in the context of Perek Gimel, the 3rd chapter, because you're dealing with the Nefesh Elikis, of pondering, meditating the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, starting with the wisdom, the understanding. Later the Alter Rebbe explains the das, the knowledge, and again it's the essentiality in this whole process. But so this is something which is a structured meditation which gives birth, not just something which is innate, not something which is inherent. I use the word just in this context because we mentioned, again, we spoke about it last week, sometimes the innate love, the innate fear runs much deeper, similar to the relationship of a child and a parent, even though not necessarily is it passionate. Like when, for example, achaisi rayasi, there's a natural connection to a family member, even children to parent, and not necessarily you see overt passion. It's more that deep, profound connection. And then there is rayasi, the spousal connection that you can and naturally does become passionate, and that is the very nature of this type of relationship, because it's two parties got to know each other and get excited about each other. But yet conversely, if you remember, we said there is the possibility, according to Torah, and again, conventionally, the idea of divorce, it's not something that has to be connected all the time, as opposed to child and parent and child, or family member. Then there is no passion, but the love or the connection runs very, very deep. So, but in this context, when we're dealing with the hisbainenos, the structured meditation, which leads to a sensation, an emotion, which is born, in other words, it comes into being as a result of this pondering and meditation of the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here, there's a uniqueness, and therefore in this context, this is called the Gadlus. This is called the great sensation of Yira, because it comes from pondering and meditating on the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The intellectual faculties of this neshama ponders on the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And because it ponders on the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it arouses a love in this context, rather fear. It can be love as well. Depends what your hitbonenut is, what the meditation is. So in this case, it's the grandness. It's a grand fear, because you're thinking about, it's an emotion associated with grandness, because the meditation which led to the emotion is also about meditation of the grandness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Bigdulas Hashem, which is Memalik Kalam. Hashem fills all the worlds in very detail. Again, please look into the Pascha. We spoke about this idea various times, but in this very context, the Memalik Kalam, the fascination of Memalik Kalam and HaKadosh Baruch Hu invests in every detail and every particle and every nuance. And that's the reason why everything looks the way it is. And because Hashem is creating it in this very fashion that it ultimately appears, and again with its appearance, and if it's a food item with its unique taste and style and so on. This is the memale, the dimension of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He fills the ilms, he fills the worlds, and part of this meditation is the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Has mi'oretz l'rakia ma'alot kushanov. The distance of earth and heaven is 500 years. If men wanted to walk 500 years, again without stop, that's impossible with the human being, rather. Human beings usually need to rest, but theoretically, if a person would, chuck along for 500 years, and that's a great distance, you can walk a lot in 500 years without stop. And that's the distance from earth to heaven. And we know there's 7 heavens. And what's the distance between each heaven is another 500 years. The lowest of the chayes, which is the highest level even beyond the rakia, as explained in the Rambam, there's the level that the spiritual realm begins. It exists within the whole entire time. It doesn't begin physically over the rakia hashvi, the 7th heaven. It means it's conceptually in other words, it's real, but it doesn't begin. The Alter Rebbe writes, Raglei Achai is here, not that it physically, because it's not physical, it doesn't begin higher than the 7th heaven, even though by the 7th heaven it's different dynamic, the way things are here physically, but in the terminology of Chayis is based on the Rambam and other Sfarim as well, that the Malachim, or those celestial beings, their lowest level is even greater than all of this put together, all of the above mentioned put together. This is the world of Malachim. And go beyond and higher than that. Kol yishtalshus kol olamis, the evolution of all worlds, l'mayla, adrei mamaylas, to the highest of heights. In Atzira, in Atzibriya, in Atzilus. And it says, and again, in these olamis, there's infinite worlds, and there's infinite amount of worlds, as the Alter Rebbe says it clearly in chapter 42, I believe. And the Malchus Chamalchus Kol, these are just 4 general olamis, 4 general worlds. And then it says even higher than Atzilus, there's Atzilus HaKlali and Atzilus HaPrati, which means the enormous amount of levels in this Ishtalshalus, in this evolution, it runs Adin Ketz. In other words, the Alter Rebbe doesn't use the Lashon Adin Ketz, but it has a bracket, or it has you can appreciate it also on an Adin Ketz level, on an infinite level. The expression is, even if we say the Ishtalshalus, even though it speaks about a lukus Adin Ketz, lamata Erin Sof is lamayla Adin Ketz, lamata mata Adin Tachlis, even though this is referring to the Ein Sof itself. But when we speak about elements, the Lashon of the Alter Rebbe himself, that in the entire Seder Ishtalshalus, in the evolution of Ishtalshalus, elements, and all these different levels, there's also infinite amount of worlds. Take an example, the Malachim. The Malachim themselves the Gemara says that reconciles of the contradiction. It seems one place that there's tens of thousands of angels. Another place says that there's infinite amount of camps of angels. And the Gemara says, yeah, there's infinite amount of camps, even though in every camp there's tens of thousands of angels. So tens of thousands is the lesser amount. This is the finite amount, and there's infinite amount of camps of malachim. And then these so many different worlds, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that perfect evolution, orchestrated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, and not only in the past, but HaMechadesh B'Tuvi B'Chol Yom Tamim Mas Bereshis, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu revitalizes creation in its precise structure, in its precise detail every day, and namely every moment, every second, as explained last week, the necessity to do so, and why Hashem must revitalize all of creation and to all its detail in all levels of all elements every single moment. Why is it so important? Again, we spoke about this last week, a famous theme in Chassidus. Chassidus explains the whole idea that there exists elements is the antithesis of the way the Ein Sof is, hence the Eibishter Hashem has to constantly create because he's bringing something. This whole concept of he's bringing something which in essence is not meant to be into being, hence he has to constantly create and pump the energy that they should be able to exist the way they exist. And again, as such, this is something which is constant. And here, see, the Alter Rebbe writes in the page 146, towards the end of chapter 52, that all these 3 elements are divided into tens of thousands of levels, which are also called Olamis Pratim, detailed Olamis, 8 detailed worlds. So the one cannot even adequately get his mind around something like this, but one thing it does arouse just by tapping in, by pondering, by meditating on this whole notion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu being the Memali Kol Almin, is in all these different levels, again mentioned briefly over here, but so much more, which exist even in this Memali Kol Almin phenomenon, how Hashem is Memali, fills the world. This, if he ponders on this with concentration, with earnestness, this arouses an enormous fear. Someone learns about the greatness of a king, and this is also the king's accomplishment, that belongs to the king. And the more the grandeur and the multitude of accomplishments or acquisitions of the king, that tells you how great the king is. And in this case, it's not only acquisitions. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created all this, and it's all this. It's not something which you can count. And Hashem not only, again, it's not something which belongs to Hashem, and He created all this, and more so, creates this on a constant basis. So one stands that arouses an enormous awe of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is the gadlus, because it comes, it's a sensation which comes of the meditation of the gadlus, on the gadlus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How Hashem is memalik kol almin, again, mentions a few details over here, but it's the common denominator between this and everything we know of Hashem from the Sfarim and what is taught to us, which is, even that is not something which we could get to the end of, but there's so naturally so much more, because we cannot, even these numbers of inkates, of camps, infinite of camps of malachim, the human mind can't appreciate the whole phenomenon of infinity. So that every detail over here of this Hisbeinanus arouses yet a deeper dimension and another layer of Yiras Hashem, awe and reverence of the Melech Malcham HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, the King of all kings. For that matter, if we notice, this is what we daven every single day. The davening begins with a whole elaboration on HaKadosh Baruch Hu's koyach of Memalik Kol Almin, or Hashem the way He is Memalik Kol Almin. If you look in the whole Psukkah de Zimra, Hashem in Hashemayim, Alu Chol Malachav, Alu Kol Tzavav, Alu Shemesh V'Yareach, Alu Kakech V'Eir, and all these details, that this is meant to and does get the Yid excited and arouses deep sensations towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, maybe love or fear. In this context, it's about fear, it's about awe, it's about reverence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here the Alter Rebbe says, here the Alter Rebbe says, so one would ask again, as we pointed this out last week, why is this called Tata? Why is it called the inferior fear? This is something which is extraordinary. Arouses a true sensation of fear, and because not only because the Yid has that Yid Hashemayim, you can say, okay, this is who he is. It's a structured meditation on the Gdulas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in areas which we can't even comprehend, but at least we know what is behind it. We know we could appreciate very much Memali Kol Almin. As the Gemara says, Ma neshama memalas haguf, af HaKadosh Baruch Hu memalas ha'olam. Ask somebody, you ever see your neshama? It's beyond seeing. It's a sensory vision. It's something which is real to me, because a person knows without his neshama, without his nefesh, he can't function. He's not alive. With it. Nefesh allows him to speak, to walk, to talk, to live, to exist, to function, and so on. So he didn't see it with his physical eye, but he knows he's excited, and he wants that constant connection of body and soul. We're not talking about the godly soul over here. The simple soul, the soul of man, the nefesh ha'adam, nefesh ha'adam, which is nefesh adam, nefesh, like the Alter Rebbe writes at the beginning of Tanya, b'dami, that soul which enters into the blood, which the blood is that conducive energy which allows the nefesh to filter the person to the person's body to make him live. That's why it's called nefesh achayunis. It allows the person to live. So you can't see with your own eyes, but you always want that connection. The person goes to sleep. He wants to make sure the next morning he hopes he makes, and that the next morning there will be again that reconnection of soul and body. For at night it's compromised, as the Gemara says. One of 60, the Kista de Chayusa, the expression of the Gemara. So he aspires that the next morning there'll be that connection. You always want that soul, even though you never saw it, but it's real to you. It's very real to you. God forbid if someone's weak, it's because there's a compromise in the connection of soul and body. So you want it to tighten up, you want it to connect, and you want to become healthy again. And so on and so forth, even though it's a nefesh you can't see with your own eyes, but perhaps it's beyond seeing something tangible. From a certain perspective, we spoke about this also last week, there's something very real. In other words, it's not something that you don't see with your physical eye, doesn't mean it's less real to you. Sometimes even to the contrary. And in this case, the Gemara says so too. We can appreciate this mamala because it's a level, it's an energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu which fills the Eilam, which we are part of. But yet, in such a grand level, in such a grand, expansive manner, which just arouses a very natural fear, or a fear rather, coming from my pondering on this greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Memale is Ha'olam, and again, with all these details in brief, though, mentioned over here, but yet encapsulating the whole message of Memale Kol Almin accurately. So why is it called an inferior fear? This seems to be apparently rightfully, justifiably, it should have been called the Ilah, the Yireh Ilah. Meaning that you're telling me that in Yireh Tata, the inferior fear, there's Katnus and Gadlus, the smallness and the grandness. Why make that division? Okay, the Katnus is that natural Yireh Shamayim Yid has, the innate Yireh Shamayim Yid has, and this comes out of as a result, and as a result of a structured pondering in the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So call this Yireh Ilah. This is an investment of one's intellectual faculties in the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this should be the fear should apparently be categorized as Ilah as well. It's grand and it's superior. Why is it part of the inferior Yirah? Why is it still part of that realm of the inferior as opposed to the superior Yirah? So the Rebbe says, and again, we also alluded to this last week. Again, probably in the whole class, you'll appreciate to go back to the previous class because we spoke about this subsequent or this information which we're learning now, also orally in the previous class. But let's see it inside. This is called an external fear. V'tato, an inferior fear. Why? Because it's being extracted, it's deriving, it's being inferred from the Eilamis, from the worlds. Which are the garments, solely the garments of the King HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, blessed be He. Hashem mistater or misalam mislabish bahem, that He hides and He conceals Himself and He encloses in them. You have three expressions. He hides in His garments, He conceals Himself in His garments, and He invests in His garments lachiyasam, to vitalize them. Again, the Olam is these worlds what the Yid is pondering on is just the garments of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we explained last week and in other times, that is the greatest Yirida, it's the greatest descend of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be a Beirei, to ultimately establish Himself as a Beirei Olam, as a creator of world. Obviously, it's only HaKadosh Baruch Hu which is the Beirei Olam. And it's only HaKadosh Baruch Hu which is Memale Kol Almin. There's no other energy. But nonetheless, we find this lahavdil by man also. There's things which he does are inferior. Even he does it himself. It's important, but that's not who he represents. We gave the other day an example that professor comes in to give an important lecture, and he comes in, he neatly takes off his coat, and he asks one of his accomplices, please hang up my coat. And immediately he starts with his lecture. And when the attendee of this lecture is going to come home and he's going to be asked, so what did you hear tonight? His wife will ask him, or anybody will ask him. He says, the lecture began with asking the one who came with him to hang up his coat and he starts repeating the lecture. That's really what happened. And he's a polite person. He just didn't leave his coat in the car, whatever it is, and he politely asks someone to hang it up, and hanging up a coat is a nice thing. It's all good, but that's not who he is. You want to describe who he is, you start from this which he conveyed in his lecture. Though he was the same person who asked to hang up his coat so politely. But that's not who he is. Certainly HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a Beirei Olam, is a creator of the world. And there's no other creator, there's no other independent energy. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Memale Kol Almin. There's no other energy which fills and creates and vitalizes and vivifies Olamis, all the Olamis. But remember, this is a great Yerida to descend of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. For the Olamis are only the garments of Hashem. And just like a garment covers up on the person who is in the garment. Yes, we spoke last week, sometimes a garment, famous Gemara, Rabbi Yechanan Yokardeli, and Moni Mechabdus Rabbi Yechanan would call his garments his koved, because garments have something magical which bring out the best of a certain aura of a person, which a person doesn't have when he doesn't have the right garments. Garments bring out a certain majesty, the majestic appearance of the person, any person for that matter, if it's a nice and handsome or a nice attire, a nice vestment, which it fits him, etc., fits the person, etc., and it brings out something nice within the person. That's why people invest in their garments. But in the end of the day, a garment is a garment, and it covers up over the person wearing the garment. And in this case, the Olamis bring out an enormous appreciation for the creator of these Olamis, for the creator of these worlds. And nonetheless, as we say, this is the greatest Yerida, descent for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that it becomes a creator. We spoke about the other day, Basar Mamoris Nivra Olam. It's just an external dimension of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He spoke creation into being. Remember once we even spoke about the contrast of the Yid, which it says, Machshavtan Shel Yisrael, all Yisrael, all of the Machshav, Yisrael are connected to the deeper dimension of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it says that they're connected to the Machshava, to the thought of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, while all of creation are associated with and connected to the speech of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Can we compare thought to speech? Speech is the most external, or one of the most external expressions of the man when of the human being, the way he wants to relate to something else. He removes himself from himself and relates to something else. If there wasn't something else or nobody else, we would never need to talk. It's only when I need to deal with something out of myself, as opposed to thought. Thought is the way I am for myself, by myself. For that matter, the Yid is even beyond that. All b'machshava. Not only within machshava, they arise, they ascend within a deeper level of machshava of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But when we spoke about this many times, Gemara, the Lashon of Zayar even says that lav urche de malka lishtoi b'milad yet. It's not even the derech of the melech to derive delight in things which are simple or trivial, petty. Yes, it's milin de it's words rather. It's words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but nonetheless, it's an inferior dimension of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Asor mamores nivra ha'olam. We once mentioned also in Avedis Hashem, someone's going to say, "Oh, doesn't the world create HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Let me just invest in Olam. Let me invest in the world. A few weeks in the Grand Canyon, and a few days in the Grand Canyon, a few here and there, because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this world, and then it comes from His speech. So let me connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu via His world." No, that's an inferior level of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In a famous Makubah was HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shu Beir Olam. We mentioned before in the expression of one of the great Makubah. It's the greatest. It's a degradation. It's a kind of shame. It's not who He is. Now, make no mistake, there's a purpose. Famous Lashon Asara Kaf B'Shekel HaKodesh. Man, we also spoke this. We must combine and fuse, synthesize the two, the way the Eibishter formed himself by himself, the way he conveyed that famous other 10. You remember the number 10, Aseres Hadibros. It's also Dibros, it's also speech, but this is the inner dimension within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way the Eibishter is. Hashem is for himself by himself. Hashem put us into this world to combine the two, to synthesize the two. That in a world which was created by Asar Mamara should be felt Aseres Hadibros, should be felt Elokus L'Shem Yichud Kutshu Bricho Ushchinte. We spoke about this in the past, the fusion of the two. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. Nisaba HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lizlei Dira B'Tachtenim. Hashem wanted a home, a dwelling place in this very physical world. So He created the physical world in order that the Yid should come and should invest the Elokus, the Ruchnias, in other words, the Anechi Hashem Elokecha, the 10 Dibris and the Teira, the energy of Teira Mitzvahs, with the Asar Amaris, with a world which was created through Asar Amaris. And that's the reason why, again, just as tidbits of what we spoke about in the past, the mitzvahs, the significant majority of our mitzvahs, which are mitzvahs, are limbs of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, the core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kitshanu b'mitzvahs, the mitzvahs are about the Kedusha, the way the Eibishter is exalted, holy, elevated, the essence of the Eibishter himself. But how are the significant majority of the mitzvahs performed? With the physical, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants the fusion of the two. Granted. But the world on its own is a levush, it's a garment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Al Rebbe Lashon, in a garment, the Hashem hides, is concealed and invested in them. To give them life, to give them existence. They should be created yesh mi'ayin, from a state of nothing, from a state of nothing to a state of something from nothing, ex nihilo, which this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's doings and workings. But how does He do it? He invests, He hides in them. How do you know Hashem hides in them? Do we have to explain it over here? Look at the Elam Hazeh. Look at the Elam Hazeh. A world which every moment and beyond that, a world which is every moment being created by from Hashem's energy. And look at the world. Is it screaming Hashem Echad? Is it demonstrating the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Not at all. How so? You're constantly, it's not like when Hashem created the world, invested His energy so many thousands of years ago. Every moment Hashem is pumping in creation. It's like even between relationship of man, if someone comes over to every single person, every millisecond and hands him over another $50 or $100. And someone asks him, did you see Mr. Joe as an example? That person who's giving you the money. Even if he's only sane, he would say, Mr. Joe. My whole existence is Mr. Joe. My mortgage is because of Mr. Joe, and my food is Mr. Joe, and so on and so forth. Because every moment he's handing him another $100 bill. In this case, every millisecond, because Baruch Hu is Mahava, Machayim, Mekayim, nothing can exist. Remember, we spoke about this a few times. We mentioned this last week as well. That if Hashem would not create something, even a stone, it wouldn't be just like it would break apart, decay, it would just disappear. The whole energy of the stone, which is again categorically the inanimate within creation, also rather exists only because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mahava, Machayim, Mekayim. The stone is pumping energy every single moment. Does that stone demonstrate Elokus? Does the botanical world demonstrate Elokus on its own? Demonstrate the Creator? Does the animal world? Does the human world naturally demonstrate the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? You have the answer. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even Al Rebbe rather writes in Perek Al-Mabab, to the contrary. Not only they don't demonstrate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but they just the mere opposite of that. Diametrically opposite, their whole being, their whole metzias, their whole presentation is diametrically opposite, is the mere opposite of demonstrating that very oneness, which is constantly creating them and giving them existence. That's the way that Hashem created the world. And that's what this is the paradox, that He's a creator who constantly creates, but how does He create? In a way that He hides, conceals Himself, invests in Himself, and you don't see the creator within creation. Now one's going to argue, okay, this is this physical world. What about the higher worlds? Olam HaYetzira, Olam HaBriya. We spoke about this as well. You have Gan Elyon. Now, what about Atzilus? A world which houses and hosts the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's no evil in Atzilus. So, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also hiding there. Apparently, they demonstrate that very oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's the whole occupation of Neshama and Gan Eden? It's that interaction with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the appreciation, it derives the light. Because the Shekhinah is overtly present and manifest in these supreme elements. Granted. But yet, make no mistake, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not Gan Eden. And Gan Tachton, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not Atzilus as well. The fact, Alter Rebbe is going to mention this later, we're going to learn about this later, but just in brief, the fact that you have an neshama which is nanin, which can appreciate the Shekhinah, that shows that's not the real essence of the Shekhinah, because the essence of Shekhinah is infinite, and the finite is consumed and becomes nothing, stands with a total self-negation and of total nothingness in the face of the infinite. Understandably so, how could a finite stand or withstand the infinite presence or the presence of infinity? And that's why if you look in the Mishnah, it says, Nanin miziv ha-Shekhinah, from the ray of the Shekhinah. It's not the Shekhinah itself. So even the superior olam, superior worlds, there's still a HaKadosh Baruch Hu is hiding with them that they could be a olam. Remember the Gemara? Olam is Malashon Helen V'Hester. It's the mere olam says it's concealing of the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We spoke about this as well in the past in different chapters, in different contexts which then explain this very nukudah, this very point, and these very points. Then you have the midas within midas in God, in the face of God. God is midasless. Midas means a measurement. So you have the midas even of Atzilus, a world which everything about Atzilus is Ein Sof, but you cannot say that this is really the core Ein Sof, because of the core Ein Sof it wouldn't be a Olam, even of Olam Atzilus. Especially we say the 10 midas of Atzilus, midah in the face of the true Ein Sof. So it says every midah has a certain Ein Sof dynamic to it, because again it's a world like Gur Chara, there's no evil, and it hosts and houses the Ein Sof. So it has a certain Ein Sof dynamic to it, each midah, granted. And again, we've got to pick up a little bit what in the previous chapters to understand this. There's kind of one way or another some brevity in these words and these terminologies, but this is something which we learn time and again. Atzilus is the most superior world, way different than all this which is lower than Atzilus. Lo yugur chara, there's no evil, and again, not only when we say in Bria, there's not this true evil, chas v'shalom, like Bria represents, or rather in Bria you have the Gan Eden ha'elyon, even Yitzira, which is the Gan Eden HaTachton, so there's no Ra, but there's Ascholus, HaMetzias, of Yeshes, some self-identity which can exist, and therefore there's Malachim, and so on and so forth. We explained this in the past, this stark quantum leap step between Atzilus and inferior worlds, or if you want to go Mamato L'mayla, if you want to talk about Mamato L'mayla from the inferior worlds to Atzilus, again, Atzilus is a world which hosts the Ein Sof, and therefore every Midah carries this Ein Sof energy, but still called a Midah. Midah means measurement. In the face of the Ein Sof, there is no measurement. It's all infinite. So every level of world, in the end, is the way the Eibishter hides his true Metzias. He conceals his true entity. He hides his true entity. He invests his true entity in them, true to give them life, to come into being the way they are. But he is concealed. So when you're thinking about the grandness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how the Hashem is memale kol almin, you're not thinking about the core essence of Hashem. Your meditation is in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's garments. Your meditations of the grandness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's garments, the vast amount of olamis, worlds, halachim, and everything we could ever learn and know and absorb about the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but this is not of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way He is for Himself, by Himself, the Hashem Himself. This is the way Hashem invests in olamis, Malashon Helen V'Hester. It's not the real deal. And therefore, it arouses the reverence that it aroused. Not only it's not the real deal, it's nothing close, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the mere fact. Again, you have olam means it's covering up, completely. Every olam covers up by definition of what it is. And this is where it's a bit different than when we spoke even about last week. Someone sees a king, that how much of his body does he see? He sees the head sticking up, and he's wrapped into his majestic garments. Someone's going to say, well, it's not the real king because most of what I see is his garment. In this case, if you think about this analogy, which we spoke about last week as well, as opposed to this which we're learning over here, if you think about it, that here at least the king's face is coming out of his garments, so you can identify this as the king. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu invests even in Atzilus, the entire Atzilus is called Olam HaAtzilus. There's no place within Atzilus that you have the Ein Sof in its purity. So imagine the king would walk out without any part of him sticking out. His head would be also covered with a garment. That would be a compromise on my appreciation of the king, hence my reverence of the king, and so on and so forth. Because he's covered up completely. I hardly noticed it. Something was moving, someone says it's the king. There's nothing you see of the king there. And this exists with every single Olam. This is the point of Hashem, Memale Kol Almin. What you appreciate is the Almin, which are the garments of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again, the Lashon Mistater, Misalama, Mislabash, he hides, he conceals himself, and he invests in them. That's why it's called Tato, inferior fear. Because you're focusing one way or another, or you're focusing rather on the inferiority of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The way the Eibishter is a Beira Elam, or on the Elam is themselves, on the garments of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We spoke last week also, it cannot, again, those who want to really appreciate also this Vart over here, again I invite you to go to last week's class. You cannot expect the Bittul Ayesh, the Bittul B'Metzias, a total self-nullification based on this pondering, as a result of this pondering, because this in itself tells you you are, because it's Memale Kol Almin, it's there to give you, to identify you. And if it's identify you, you can't expect pondering on something which is identifying you that you should in turn be completely batel b'metzias, completely annulled in this energy. You can appreciate it again, that Bittul Hayesh definitely comes about through this meditation, but not Bittul b'metzias. Again, I welcome you to go to the previous classes. We elaborate on this point as well. Because in the end of the day, this is again an inferior, or this is the levushim, is the garment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's what you're pondering on. So the yira, the fear, is external. It's not Hashem himself. It's the external yira, it's the inferior yira. But he says, it's good enough. In chokhmah, this will lead you, inevitably, to get involved, and become connected to, and be scrupulous with the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and learning Hashem's Torah, and doing Hashem's mitzvahs. For the reason you want to, again, you want to become, you appreciate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the reverence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the arousal of the reverence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, automatically tells you to not chas v'sholem, to do something that Hashem is standing there and saying do not do it, or to want to become close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Also, even based on Yiras Hashem, like Dr. Rebbe writes in Perek Mem Aleph, that Yira also brings, I want to align myself with what this king, in this case, Melech HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, demands from me, and to do it perfectly and scrupulously. And therefore, the lashon in the expression in Pirkei Avos, Imen Yira in Chochmah, because this Yira will bring you into the Chochmah, will bring you into a life of Torah, a life of mitzvahs. And that's what he says, Rakshi Ashar, this is indeed the gateway, Pesach, and the doorway, L'kiyum HaTorah mitzvahs, to fulfilling Hashem's Torah, learning Hashem's Torah, fulfilling Hashem's Torah, and abiding scrupulously by His mitzvahs. Then the Mishnah continues, Imei Chochmah in Yira. There's a much higher level of that. When you gain that Yira Shamayim, the level of Katnos, and in this context, in this case, the level of Gadlus, pondering of the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which arouses from you this awe, this fear, this reverence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That leads you consequently to a life of Torah mitzvahs. And you live the life of Torah mitzvahs. You're connected with the Chochmas Hashem, the wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. That will open up a new doorway, a new gateway to different quality type of yira classified over here, the yira ilah, the supreme yira, which we look forward learning about this coming week. Have a good night. Be'ezus Hashem, have a good night.